Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in Tennessee. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time you started this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these forgotten histories travel, across states, across oceans, across time itself. Let's begin. The year was 1872. The Cumberland Hills were still thick with fog and pine, and the new railroad tracks that cut through the valleys had only begun to hum with the sound of freight and cattle. In a narrow corridor of that landscape, somewhere between the towns of Columbia and Hohenwald, there once stood a quiet settlement known to the locals as New Harmony Hollow. On most maps of the period, it wasn't marked at all. A single surviving photograph remains, taken on brittle glass sometime in the mid-1880s. It shows a cluster of timber buildings set against a ridge, with men in heavy coats standing stiffly before a white meeting house. The sky is overexposed, washed to bone. At the photograph's edge, you can just make out the faint blur of women in long dresses, their faces lost in motion. Archivists believe the image was captured by a traveling surveyor before the community vanished entirely. For those who study this story, that photograph is the only known proof that New Harmony Hollow ever existed. The settlement began as an offshoot of a small Protestant congregation from northern Alabama. In the spring of 1871, a charismatic preacher named Reverend Elias Harrow led 43 followers northward, claiming he'd received a vision during a thunderstorm that God demanded a pure valley, untouched by commerce or sin. They sold their possessions, loaded wagons, and followed the preacher into the Tennessee hills, where they founded their new home beside a narrow creek that fed into the Duck River. At first, local newspapers praised them. The Pulaski Gazette called it a bold experiment in godly living. Within a year, however, the tone changed. Supply merchants complained the group refused to trade. Traveling peddlers said they were turned away at gunpoint. The townspeople of Columbia began calling them the closed flock. By the mid-1870s, the community numbered nearly 200. They built their own mills, crafted furniture, and cultivated a vast hillside orchard, whose cider was rumored to be sweet enough to mask the taste of spoiled water. Outsiders rarely entered, yet the sound of hymns, slow, droning, and strangely discordant, carried across the valley on Sunday evenings. Travelers reported hearing them long before the road curved toward the settlement, as though the voices rose from beneath the earth. The first disappearances seemed coincidental. In 1876, 2 laborers hauling timber from the nearby ridge never returned to town. Search parties found their mules grazing at the tree line and tracks leading down toward the hollow, but heavy rain erased the trail before anyone could follow it. A deputy sheriff visited the settlement, only to be met by a dozen men in identical coats who claimed the strangers had never arrived. The deputy, outnumbered and uneasy, left before nightfall. A year later, a peddler named Isaac Morse vanished after boasting in the tavern that he planned to sell knives and lanterns to the Hollow's residents. His cart was discovered in a ravine, 2 miles from their main gate, the wheels still turning in the creek water. The reins had been cut. Rumors spread that Reverend Harrow had forbidden trade with the profane world, and that any outsider who crossed their boundary was seen as an intruder against the covenant. Through the 1880s, records from neighboring counties mention New Harmony Hollow only in passing. Church tax lists, census slips, and a few birth certificates filed by a midwife who occasionally traveled there. She later told a doctor in Lawrenceburg that the Hollow's children were quiet to the point of dread, and that none of them ever cried in her presence. By 1885, local farmers began noticing strange fires in the hills, single flames burning through the night, like lanterns fixed high on poles. When riders approached, the lights vanished. One hunter claimed he found the charred remains of livestock arranged in circles, their eyes removed. Another said he saw a procession of people moving through the fog, each carrying a small mirror in their right hand. Reverend Harrow died in 1886. His followers buried him somewhere on the north slope, marking the spot only with a wooden cross burned with a spiral symbol. After his death, leadership passed to a council of elders who called themselves the Keepers of the Vow. The sect grew stricter. They built tall fences and carved words of scripture into the lintels of every doorway. They claimed the outside world had fallen into decay and that only by silence and obedience could they remain pure. It was during this decade that the missing began to multiply. A county clerk later compiled a list, 39 names between 1887 and 1890 alone. Most were travelers, rail workers, or peddlers. A few were local youths who'd gone hunting and never returned. When a sheriff's posse finally marched toward the hollow in 1891, they found the gates open but the streets empty. Smoke still rose from the chimneys, food lay half-eaten on tables, and laundry fluttered on the lines. The inhabitants had vanished as if in the middle of their day. Inside the meeting house, the posse found rows of benches, a pulpit, and beneath it, a heavy trap-door leading to a cellar. The air below was damp and carried the smell of lime and wood oil. Against the far wall stood dozens of wooden crates, each marked with the same spiral symbol burned onto Harrow's grave. The sheriff's report, later filed in Nashville, stated that the crates contained an assortment of bones, both human and animal, indistinctly arranged. The remains were reburied in a mass grave near the county line. Within weeks, the case was closed for lack of living witnesses, yet the story didn't end there. Over the next decade, people continued to disappear in the surrounding hills. Hunters found paths cleared anew, cabins repaired, and signs of habitation long after the settlement was presumed deserted. A prospector who camped nearby in 1897 claimed he woke at midnight to see lamplight moving through the orchard, figures dressed in grey, walking in single file. When he called out, the lights dimmed until nothing remained but the wind in the trees. By 1900, at least 289 individuals had been recorded as missing within a 25-year span. Some were transients, others residents from nearby towns. Newspapers tried to tie the disappearances to bandits or floods, but locals whispered that the closed flock had never died, that they'd merely gone deeper underground, living in the limestone caverns that honeycombed the valley. Cattle still vanished. Travelers still heard hymns rising from nowhere, and the orchard somehow still bore fruit. When the county sheriff's report was archived in 1891, it was sealed under the heading Abandoned Religious Settlement, no crime established. For the men who entered the hollow that day, the matter was finished. But among their descendants, and among those who tried to farm that cursed valley afterward, the silence never quite left. In 1893, a small family named Benton purchased the tract for lumber rights. They moved into one of the remaining cabins and wrote letters to relatives, describing the eerie stillness of the place. Mrs. Benton wrote that she could hear children humming in the orchard, though her own were asleep. Within months, all 5 members of the Benton family vanished. Their horses were found still tethered, the barn door ajar, a lamp burning low in the window. No footprints led away from the house. The sheriff refused to open another file. By then, talk of the hollow had spread far beyond the county. Preachers used it as a warning against false prophets. Journalists came hoping to write exposés about cult madness and rural hysteria. Yet those who traveled to the site often returned changed, or didn't return at all. A reporter from Nashville named Charles Latham published one final article before disappearing himself. He wrote that he'd spent 3 nights in the abandoned meeting house and had heard footsteps pacing in the cellar, though there was no trapdoor any longer, only earth packed smooth as slate. He ended his piece with a single line: "They still gather when the fog is thick." A year later, a new settlement tried to reclaim the valley. German immigrants, mostly carpenters and orchardmen, rebuilt several of the old houses. They renamed the place Harmony Vale, hoping to erase the stigma. But the records show that within 2 winters, nearly half the colonists left without explanation. Those who stayed spoke of lights in the hills, hand of a Sunday visitor, a tall man who came at dusk to ask if they had kept the vow. When they demanded to know who he was, he simply smiled and said, "The elder watches." By the turn of the century, the government officially declared the land uninhabitable due to flooding from the new river works. The valley was condemned, its structures dismantled. Yet decades later, surveyors still reported finding carved scripture stones deep in the undergrowth, perfectly preserved, as though someone still cleaned them. There exists, in the Tennessee State Archive, a ledger that once belonged to Reverend Harrow's counsel, its pages rescued from a fire sale in 1908. Most of the writing has faded to grey, but one entry stands clear in ink that resists age. When the number is fulfilled, the circle shall close. Beneath it, the faint signature of 7 hands, initials only, the last one marked with the spiral brand. Historians believe these 7 were the keepers of the vow. In 1910, the valley flooded entirely. New maps labelled the region simply Marshland 23. Yet even after the waters rose, locals continue to speak of music drifting over the low ground on clear nights, hymns slow and tuneless, echoing through the reeds. Fishermen claim their nets caught fragments of carved wood, hymnals and once a child's shoe, polished as if by years of hands passing it down. The state finally posted warning signs, no trespass, unstable ground, but trespassers still came. In 1915, a pair of students from the University of Nashville visited the site to study folklore. They found remnants of fence posts and one surviving apple tree still bearing fruit. When they sliced it open, they found the flesh inside streaked with red, as if the juice itself had remembered blood. They left before nightfall, leaving their tent and notes behind. Only their camera returned, discovered days later by a trapper, half buried in silt. The last photograph on the roll showed the same meeting house from the 1880s image, except now in the doorway, a faint silhouette stood, head bowed, hands clasped in prayer. The camera had been set on a timer. Both students were in the frame. The figure behind them was not. After that, no one attempted to rebuild or settle the hollow again. By 1920, it had become a ghost name, a story told at crossroads and church picnics, part cautionary tale, part curse. The missing were never found, their numbers absorbed into state ledgers as unrecovered persons. 289 lives erased across 25 years, folded into the soil of one forgotten valley. Today, the land lies under a shallow reservoir fed by the Duck River. Locals say that when the water level drops after a dry summer, the steeple of the meeting house breaks the surface for a day or two before sinking again. They call it the drowning church. Some nights, drivers on the old highway claim to see lantern light moving beneath the water, drifting in slow procession toward the center of the lake. And though the last witness is long dead, those who have studied the old photographs agree on one strange detail. In the earliest image, the one taken before the vanishings, there are 43 figures standing before the meeting house. In the final image, the blurred one recovered from the student's camera, there are 44. No one can say who the last figure was or when it joined them. Only that the number at last was fulfilled. They drained the reservoir in the winter of 1948. For nearly 40 years, the valley had slept beneath silt and cattails, its name erased from maps and deeds. I was with the Tennessee Valley Authority then, a junior archivist sent from Nashville to catalogue boundary changes and waterline adjustments. Nothing more than clerical work. I remember the rain that week, a thin grey mist that seemed to rise from the very mud, and the sound of machines groaning as the pumps began to empty the basin. No one expected to find much. A few drowned trees, perhaps the bones of some mule wagons left behind when the waters came. But on the third day, one of the engineers shouted from the far bank that a roof line had surfaced. We crossed on planks laid over the sucking mud, and there, beneath the reed beds, a structure emerged. Its steeple half collapsed, its boards stained the color of ash. The men laughed uneasily. I didn't, because I knew what that place was. The report from 1891 had been in my care for years. A forgotten file marked abandoned religious settlement. No crime established. I told no one. It felt wrong to speak the name aloud. Over the next week, the water continued to fall, revealing the rest of the old valley. Cabin foundations, a stone well, the black ribs of a mill wheel, everything preserved as if waiting. The mud held the prints of our boots for minutes, before slowly closing again, as though unwilling to let go. My assignment was simple. Photograph. Record and tag each structure before reclamation crews arrived. I worked alone with a small camera and notebook, moving carefully through the skeletal remains. On the fourth morning, I entered what had once been the meeting house. The air smelled faintly of apple and lime, sweet then acrid. Inside, pews lay scattered like ribs, and through a broken floorboard I could see the mouth of a narrow stairwell descending into the dark. It shouldn't have been there. The 1891 report claimed the trapdoor had been sealed and the cellar filled. Yet here it was, yawning open as though waiting for its inventory to resume. I lowered my flashlight and saw brick walls slick with water and a row of shelves carved into the stone. On them sat jars, dozens, maybe hundreds, sealed with wax and labeled in the same careful hand. The ink had bled with age, but one word appeared again and again: vow. When I tried to open a jar, the wax crumbled into powder. Inside was only dirt, pale as flour. I replaced the lid and climbed back to the surface, feeling as though I had intruded on something half asleep. That night I filed my notes, but omitted mention of the jars. I told myself they were probably samples, soil for fertilizer or medicine. Still, the word stayed with me. Vow. A week later, a shipment of old county ledgers arrived at my desk, sent from the courthouse in Lawrenceburg for disposal. Most were water-damaged, their pages fused together. But within the bundle, I found a smaller book wrapped in oilcloth. Its cover bore a spiral mark burned into the leather. Inside, the script matched the entries from Reverend Harrow's counsel, the same looping, deliberate hand. The pages were filled with numbers, each line beginning with a date and ending with a single initial. I traced them forward, 1872, 1873, 1874, and then continuing long past 1891, long after the community was said to have vanished. The final entry read August 18, 1909, T. After that, the ink trailed into nothing. I brought the ledger home that night, unable to leave it in the office. My wife noticed the smell first, old smoke and mold. I told her it was only paperwork. But later, when the house was quiet, I spread the book across the dining table and studied the pattern of numbers. There were 289 entries exactly, each line marked with a small cross beside the initial. The final pages were smeared with something dark that had stiffened the paper. I wrote a memorandum to my supervisor recommending preservation. He never replied. 2 days later, the ledger disappeared from my drawer, replaced with a note in pencil. Leave the hollow alone. No signature. By spring, the reservoir project resumed. The meeting house was scheduled for demolition. I requested one last visit, under the pretense of collecting data on construction timber. Permission was granted. When I returned to the site, the air was strangely still. The water had receded farther, exposing the orchard hill. To my surprise, rows of apple trees stood there, alive and bearing fruit despite decades under silt. The workers refused to touch them. They said the roots ran too deep, that the trunks bled red sap when cut. I picked one of the apples. It was small, perfectly round, and cold to the touch, though the sun was high. When I bit into it, the taste was sweet at first, then bitter, metallic. I spat it out and threw the rest into the mud. Inside the meeting house, I found that the cellar had flooded again. A thin film of water covered the floor, reflecting the rafters like a mirror. As I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into the back wall, 7 spirals interlocking, newly cut, the grooves still sharp. Someone had been there recently. That night, back at my quarters, I heard a sound from the trunk where I'd stored my field notes, a faint tapping like knuckles against glass. When I opened it, the smell of lime rose thick and sour, and my notebook pages were damp as if they'd absorbed humidity from nowhere. Between the leaves of paper lay a clump of pale soil, the same texture I'd seen inside the jars. I threw it out the window and locked the trunk. But sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw rows of pews sinking beneath dark water, and behind them, a figure standing where the pulpit had been, its face turned upward as though listening for something above the surface. By morning, I had convinced myself it was exhaustion. I asked to be reassigned to another district, citing poor health. The request was approved, but before I left, I received one final envelope from the Nashville office. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, overexposed, of the drained valley taken from a survey plane. At first it seemed ordinary, a patch of mud, the shadow of the meeting house. Then I noticed the lighter area near the center of the frame, a perfect circle of pale earth, as though something enormous had pressed upward from beneath. Scrawled on the back in red pencil were 4 words: "The circle shall close." I left Tennessee within the week, but the farther I traveled, the more that valley seemed to follow me, in the taste of water, in the smell of paper, in the quiet between radio stations, when a low hum would rise like a hymn too old to remember. I returned to Nashville in May of 1949 and resumed ordinary duties, indexing property rolls, checking warehouse inventories, stamping paper that no one would ever read. The ledger from the hollow was gone, but its memory worked at me like a splinter under skin. Sometimes in the soundproof hush of the archive basement, I would hear the click of a typewriter that no one was using. It always came from the same corner, where the damaged files from Lawrence County had been stored. In August, a memo arrived from the Bureau of Reclamation. The reservoir was to be permanently lowered by 10 feet to ease pressure on the new dam. I was asked to accompany the inspection crew because of my familiarity with the site records. I told myself I would go only to close the file once and for all. My wife begged me not to. She said that since the valley, I had begun speaking in my sleep, reciting numbers in a whisper. I promised her I'd be back before Sunday service. When we reached the basin, the summer air smelled of algae and rust. The engineers had built a temporary road across the mudflats, leading to what remained of the orchard hill. Every tree there had died, their branches silver with salt, but the stumps had grown hollow, filled with stagnant water that rippled without wind. Something about that stillness unsettled the crew. One by one they drifted back to the trucks, until I was the only one left walking the ridge. I found the old meeting house again, only its foundation now, the stones mottled and slick. Among them lay shards of glass, and when I lifted one I saw that it was not window pane but the neck of a jar, its wax seal intact. Inside was a smear of pale soil and what looked like a fragment of parchment. I turned it in the light. A word was visible in brown script, August. The ink was fresh. The wind died completely then, and for a moment I could hear water dripping far below, rhythmic as breath. I stepped closer to the edge of the foundation and saw that the floor had collapsed, opening into a pit. From its depth came a cool draught smelling of apples and lime. I leaned in with my flashlight, just mud and stone, nothing else. Yet the beam seemed swallowed before it touched the bottom. Then the light caught movement, a shimmer as if the mud itself were breathing. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but the surface had gone still again. That night we camped near the dam. I dreamed of rows of pews rising through the water, and of voices counting in unison, slow and patient, until they reached 289. When I woke, the camp was silent. The others slept as though drugged. At dawn we broke camp, but as we drove away I saw a figure standing on the ridge behind us, tall, coat fluttering in the heat. For an instant I thought it raised its hand in farewell. Then the fog rolled over and the shape was gone. Back in Nashville, the typewriter in the basement corner began again. I waited one evening after the others had gone, tracing the sound until I reached the shelf where the Lawrence County boxes were stored. There, among the files, sat my old field notebook, the one I had thrown away. Its pages were clean, rewritten in a hand not mine, every line dated and numbered. The final entry read, May 12, 1949. The key lights in the basement flickered. When they steadied, the notebook was closed and the smell of apple filled the air. I left without touching anything. 2 days later, I went to the riverfront station to send a parcel north. It contained my resignation letter, my house key, and a short note for my wife. Do not look for me in the archives. I have to finish the count. The ticket clerk remembered me purchasing a single fare to Columbia, the nearest town to the old valley. No one saw me board. Weeks passed. Then, during the late summer drawdown, a maintenance diver working near the dam intake reported seeing a light far below, small, steady, moving between the timbers of the drowned meeting house. He swam closer, thinking it a lantern dropped by surveyors, but when he reached it the light went out. In its place lay a notebook, open, its pages undisturbed by the current. He surfaced without it, unable to explain how the paper had remained dry. The authorities called my disappearance voluntary. The office sealed my desk, and in the archive basement the typewriter was finally removed. Yet some nights, when the building settles and the air ducts hum, the guards still hear the faint click of keys from the empty corner, slow, deliberate, counting by ones. When they check, a sheet of fresh paper rests in the machine, bearing a single word typed over and over in perfect alignment. Vow. They lock the room again, turn off the light, and leave the sound behind them. By morning the paper is gone, and the water in the reservoir, they say, rises a little higher each year, though no one can tell why. The reels arrived by mistake. At least that's what the shipping invoice claimed, a misfiled box from the TVA storage vault in Decatur, Alabama, labeled audio, Field Survey 1949. I'd been cataloguing post-war engineering recordings for the State Archive. Half my days spent listening to static and machinery hum. When I threaded the first reel onto the playback deck, I expected more of the same. The clatter of pumps, men calling measurements across water. Instead, I heard singing. It came faint, like something caught beneath the hiss of old tape, voices in unison, slow, syllables drawn out until the words dissolved into tone. The recording was dated 3 months after the disappearance of the TVA archivist, whose file I knew by reputation alone. His name was spoken rarely in the department, always in low tones, as if invoking him might bring paperwork tumbling from the shelves. The reel had been sealed in wax paper, marked, "Do not circulate." I played it 3 times before I noticed the pattern beneath the hymn, a second sound, irregular, clicking like a telegraph. When I slowed the playback to half speed, the rhythm resolved into counting. A man's voice barely audible, whispering numbers between the measures of the song. It began at 1 and rose steady until the tape ended at 289. I sat for a long time after the reel spun out, the tape flapping against the head. Something about the count felt deliberate, ceremonial. I checked the catalogue ledger again. The box had no listed origin point, only a field tag reading Reservoir Drain Survey, Duck River Basin, the same basin that had covered the hollow. I called the Decatur depot to confirm the shipment. The clerk on the line swore the reels had never existed. When I asked for the manifest, he paused, then said quietly, "Sir, that box was sealed before I was born." He hung up before I could reply. Over the next weeks, I listened to the reels obsessively, trying to isolate the background noises and wind, water, the faint crackle of microphones older than my parents. Each playback seemed to reveal new details. A distant hammering, the echo of voices counting in reply. Once, near the end of a reel, I thought I heard a word spoken between the numbers, vow. But when I rewound, it was gone. I began cross-referencing the audio with TVA survey logs from 1949. One entry stood out, incident at Duck River intake. Diver report of light activity, no follow-up. Attached was a short memorandum from an archivist named Thorne, the same man who had vanished that year. His note ended with the line, "The count will be completed upon next drawdown." No one in the building remembered him. Even his personnel file was a ghost, a placeholder without photograph or address. It was as though the man had been erased deliberately, his absence tidied into bureaucracy. That night I took a copy of the tape home. Against every rule, I wanted to hear it without the fluorescent hum of the archive around me. I played it in the dark, letting the hymn fill the room. The sound seemed older than the recording itself, the voices too many to have fit in the small valley. Sometimes one tone would falter, replaced by another lower and more resonant, as if the earth itself was singing along. At 2:47 on the tape, the counting stopped. A moment of silence followed, long enough that I thought the reel had ended. Then a man's breath entered the microphone, slow, close, and he whispered, 44. After that, the hymn resumed, louder, the tape hissing as if straining against it. When it finished, I could still hear the echo in the walls long after the machine had stopped. I didn't sleep. Instead, I read every document I could find about the old settlement, the same stories the archivists must have read before me, the fires in the hills, the spiral marks, the orchard that refused to die. Each record ended abruptly around 1910, the year the valley flooded. The official line said no trace of the inhabitants remained, but the tape argued otherwise. The next morning, I requested travel clearance to visit the Duck River site. The dam was still operational, though automated now, its control building abandoned except for a few maintenance crews. I drove south along Highway 50, following the curve of the river until the land flattened into reeds and brown water. The smell hit first, metallic like apples left too long in a tin bucket. The reservoir had receded that summer, exposing mudflats streaked with old roots. Near the center, I saw the faint line of stone where the meeting house once stood. I carried my recorder and notebook, the same model used by the TVA in the 40s. The mud swallowed my boots as I walked. When I reached the foundation, the air turned cold despite the heat. I set the microphone down and stood in silence. For a long time, there was only the whine of insects and the slow drip of water from the dam spillway, then faintly a hum, low harmonic, rising from beneath my feet. At first I thought it was the wind resonating through the stones, but the sound grew clearer, forming the shape of a hymn I recognized from the tape. I switched the recorder on. The levels spiked immediately, red across the gauge, though no source was visible. The hum became words, old, blurred by accent, and among them a single phrase emerged again and again. "The vow remains." I backed away, the mud pulling at my legs. The sound followed, matching my pace until it faded into the drone of the dam. When I checked the recorder later, the tape was blank except for static and my own breathing. Still, when I slowed the playback, I heard something faint in the hiss, a rhythmic pulse, steady, counting upward from 1. I left the reservoir before sunset, the weight of that humming still in my chest. Back in my motel room, I tried to convince myself it was machinery, pressure in the pipes or wind through the intake gates. But when I played the reel again, the count resumed from where it had left off in the valley. Not 1, not 2. It began at 45. The following morning, a TVA representative met me in the motel lobby. He said he'd received a call from Nashville about my access request. "Bureau property," he reminded me, polite but firm. "Anything you've recorded must be surrendered for review." I handed him the duplicate tape. He didn't ask for the original hidden in my bag. That night, I drove north through Columbia toward the state line, planning to hand the reel over to a journalist I trusted, a man who'd written about cold cases and missing persons. But halfway there, static filled the car radio. Between bursts of white noise came fragments of the same hymn, faint but distinct. I turned the dial. It followed me across every frequency, growing louder as I approached the hills. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the sound vanished again, leaving only the hum of the tires and my own heartbeat. I stopped for gas, and when I stepped out, the attendant stared at me strangely. He said my shirt was wet across the chest, though there'd been no rain. When I looked down, I saw dark stains where the seatbelt had pressed. The smell was unmistakable, lime and waterlogged wood. I left the car there and walked the rest of the way. The journalist never showed. Later, I learned he'd received my telegram but not my follow-up letter. It arrived a week after I vanished. Inside was a fragment of transcript typed on an old machine. It read, "August 18th, 1909, T44 complete. The vow continues. I remember little after that night. Only flashes, the bridge over the Duck River, the sound of boots in mud, the faint reflection of lamplight beneath the water. Sometimes I think I saw others walking beside me, silhouettes in long coats, their faces hidden by the mist. They moved in perfect rhythm, as if drawn by a sound too low for ears to catch. When I came to, I was lying on the bank near the dam. The reel-to-reel recorder sat beside me, its tape spun out across the mud, half buried like roots. The counter on the machine had stopped at 289. I wound the tape back, trembling, and pressed play. Nothing but silence. Yet in that silence something waited, a pressure behind the quiet listening. I knew then the count was never meant to end. I sent the recording to the archive by mail and resigned the following week. They wrote back months later, thanking me for my donation of blank media. Apparently, when the tape was opened, it was empty. They stored the box in a climate-controlled vault. 5 years later, the vault flooded during a freak power outage. Every reel inside dissolved into grey pulp, except one. Its label, nearly washed away, still bore a single handwritten word, "Vow." No one plays it now. When the archivists walk past its case, the sensors glitch, microphones hiss, and in the distant pipes they swear they hear faint music. Sometimes, late at night, the building alarms trigger themselves, doors unlocking one by one as if an inventory were being taken. I visit the reservoir once each year. The water never settles. It breathes. On windless evenings, small ripples travel outward from the center, where the steeple once broke the surface. Locals call it the circle. They say when the moon is right, you can hear the voices counting just below the current. No one goes close anymore. Last winter, after a long drought, the lake bed cracked open near the orchard hill. A farmer's son found a jar there, sealed in wax, the spiral brand still visible. He brought it to the sheriff's office. They kept it in evidence for a week before it disappeared. The deputy on duty swears he heard typing from the storage room that night, though the building had no typewriters left. The valley sleeps again now, buried beneath its reservoir. But each decade the waterline shifts a little higher, as if the land beneath still draws breath. And somewhere in the deep silt lies every record, every ledger, every number whispered by those who kept the vow, waiting for the count to begin anew. If you ever stand at the edge of that lake and hear a low hum rising from below, do not lean closer. Because what you hear is not the wind. It is memory, breathing through the water. It is the sound of names unspoken too long, waiting to be spoken again. And if you listen long enough, you might hear them counting. Slow, patient, reaching once more for the number that will complete the circle. The number that ends and begins everything. 289.